All right, so today we are moving from discussing middle childhood to adolescence. Adolescence is a period that spans from about 11 or 12 up into adulthood. And the age for adulthood, the opinion on that kind of varies. Some people would say that it starts at 18, since that's sort of when you graduate, you move away from home. Others say that adolescence continues into the early 20s, and so by that definition, some of you may technically still be in adolescence. So like with all the other periods, we're going to start by talking about physical and cognitive development, and then we'll talk about social and emotional development as well. Obviously, one of the main events that happens during adolescence is puberty. And puberty mostly involves some growth, so some physical growth of the overall body. But of course, the main thing involved in puberty is sexual maturation. And so you have maturing of the reproductive system and everything that accompanies that. And so we'll spend a decent amount of time today talking about puberty. I don't know if you guys ever pay attention to these little pictures. Usually they're pretty like straightforward things that are associated with it. The one for puberty, does anybody know what that's from? All right, so if you haven't seen it, there's a show on Big Mouth, or on Netflix called Big Mouth. And it's about kids that are in sort of this like adolescent period. And these are hormone monsters, which basically kind of help guide them through puberty. So that's why I chose that image. It was kind of hard to find any image associated with puberty that would be appropriate to put on a PowerPoint slide for class. So that was the one that made the most sense to me. So we'll talk about puberty. We'll talk about some other health issues that come up during adolescence. So because you go through puberty, this is a time where a lot of teenagers start engaging in sexual activities. They may experiment with drug use, and so a lot of the health issues that come during adolescence are from some of those like risky behaviors that teenagers engage in. We probably won't have time to get to it today, but then we'll move on to talking about cognitive development. Like always, we'll talk about Piaget's stage, and then we'll talk about some of the other perspectives on cognitive development. All right, so we're starting with puberty, and puberty is initiated by a number of hormonal changes that really start much earlier than adolescence, but they kind of build up over time and eventually trigger puberty. So some of the main hormones that are playing a role in the gains in body size are growth hormone and a hormone called thyroxine, which basically stimulates the thyroid. And both of those work together to basically just contribute to some of the growth spurts that you have during adolescence. In addition to that, there are sex hormones that play a role in both growth and also in maturation of the reproductive system. There's two classes of sex hormones. There's what's called androgens and estrogens. Typically, people describe the androgens as being the male hormones and the estrogens as being the female hormones. But in reality, you have both of those hormones no matter what your gender or sex is. It's just that females tend to have more of the estrogens and males tend to have more of the androgens. So the androgens would be things like testosterone, for example. So girls have estrogen, and they also have adrenal androgens. The androgens in girls contribute to some of the physical body growth that's happening, so basically just getting bigger overall. But then, of course, the estrogens contribute to the more sexual maturation that girls undergo. So that's going to contribute to the growth of breasts. It's going to help, the vagina and uterus develop and mature in girls specifically. The androgens in boys play a similar role where they're contributing to the overall body growth. Because men have more of the androgens, particularly testosterone, they have larger growths in muscle, things like that. Males also do have estrogens as well, and so males who go through puberty may also experience some growth of the breasts, which can sometimes be uncomfortable, but that typically kind of levels off and declines in late adolescence. Like I said, the triggering of these hormones actually starts fairly early, so it's around age 6 or 8 when these hormones start to increase, but you don't really start to see the signs of them until puberty, which tends to range from around 10 to 12 years old. And so those hormones are kind of building up over time to eventually trigger some of these changes that you see. And like I said, these hormones contribute to these large growth spurts that teenagers go through during adolescence. But there are pretty significant differences in these growth spurts for boys and girls. Girls tend to have their growth spurts earlier. So around age 10 is when they have their sort of peak growth spurt, and so they grow taller than boys during this time, whereas boys typically don't start until around age 12 and a half or so. For boys, the main proportions that change is that their shoulders broaden, so they're sort of packing muscle onto their arms. They also grow longer legs, so they become much taller. But again, that's happening later at around age 12 and a half. For girls, one of the main things that happen is that their hips broaden. So I talked about how estrogen stimulates breast growth, but it also stimulates just sort of packing or storage of fat all over the body. But there are different proportions, for different areas of the body. And so the hips tend to pack on more fat. Obviously, the breasts do as well. And so it's that estrogen that triggers basically the proportions that we tend to associate with females. Males, on the other hand, tend to gain more muscle, which leads to aerobic efficiency, whereas females during this time are typically gaining more fat. In addition to that overall growth, like I said, you have maturation of the reproductive systems. For girls, puberty is triggered by what's called menarche, which is essentially the onset of the first menstrual cycle or the first period. Like I said, the age range for the onset of puberty is actually pretty wide. I think it said 10 up to 12, but I think 12 and a half is like the average age of puberty, but it can actually span from like 10 and a half to 15 and a half. So there's a pretty wide range of when that menarche can start, but average, like I said, is 12 and a half. For girls, menarche is happening after that growth spurt that we talked about that typically happens around 10. And that basically allows the female to grow to the correct proportions so that she could potentially withstand childbirth, basically. And so menarche doesn't happen until after she's had that growth, so that if she were to get pregnant, then she would be able to basically undergo childbirth given the body proportions that they have. During the first year and a half after menarche, even though the girl is having periods, it's typically not, they're not releasing eggs during that first year or so. And so even though they may have a period, they still might not be able to get pregnant during that time. Boys, whenever they start puberty, they undergo what's called spermarchy, which spermarchy is basically the first ejaculation that occurs. And again, there's kind of an age range for when that happens, but the average is about 13, around the same time that you have that sort of peak growth spurt. Let's see, what are some of the other things? So for girls, menarche is pretty obvious, right? You have your first period and it's really obvious that happens. For boys, there are things that kind of lead up to the first ejaculation that signal that puberty is happening. So they may have enlargement of the testicles and penis, for example. Their larynx and their voice cords are lengthening, which leads to a deepening of the voice. Girls also have a deepening in the voice, but not quite as profound or extreme as boys do. In addition to that, of course, boys also start to grow facial hair around this time, and girls also are growing, underarm hair and pubic hair, and all of those are being triggered by the sexual hormones that we talked about. There are some pretty